The second interlude of Derry. Quique impassa mestra vide et quara pars magna fur. A message by Virgil. You don't fuck around with the infinite. A message by Mean Streets. February 14, 1985. Two more disappearances in the past week. Both children, just as I was beginning to relax. One of them was a 6-year-old boy named Dennis Tora. The other, a girl of just 5 who was sledding in back of her house on West Broadway. The high school mother found her sled, one of those blue plastic flying saucers, but nothing else. There had been a fresh fall of snow the night before, 4 inches or so. No tracks but hers. Chef Rand Macher said when I call him, he is because extremely annoyed with me. I think not anything that's going to keep me awake nights. I have worse things to do than that, don't I? Ask him if I could see the police photos. He refused. Ask him if her tracks led away toward any of James of sewer grading. This was followed by a long period of silence. Then Randmacher said, I'm beginning to wonder if maybe you couldn't see a doctor, Hanlon. The head pepper kind of doctor. The kid was snatched by her father. Don't you read the papers? Was the Toro boy snatched by his father, I asked. Another long pause. Give it a rest, Hanlon, he said. Give me a rest. He hanged up. Of course, I read the papers. Don't I put them out in the reading room of the public library each morning myself? The little girl, Lauren Ann Winterbagger, had been in the custody of her mother following an Ackerson divorce proceeding in the spring of 1982. The police are operated on the theory that Horst Winterbagger, who is supposedly working as a machinery maintenance man somewhere in Florida, drove up to Maine to snatch his daughter. They further theorized that he parked his car beside the house and called to his daughter, who then joined Hessens the lack of any tracks other than the little girl's. They have less to say about the face. That the girl had not seen her father since she was 2. Part of the deep bitterness which occupied the Winterbaggers' divorce came from Mrs. Winterbagger's allegedness that on at least 2 occasions Horst Winterbagger had sexually monopolized the child. She asked the court to deny Winterbagger all visitation rights, a request the court granted in spite of Winterbagger's hot denials. Randmarcher claims the court's decision, which had the effect of cutting Winterbagger off completely from his only child, may have pushed Winterbagger into talking his daughter. That at least has some dim possibility, but ask yourself this. Would little Lorian Ann have recognized him after 3 years and run to him when he called her? Randmacher says yes, even though she was 2 the last time she saw him. I don't think so. And her mother says Lauren Ann had been well trained about not approaching or talking to strangers, a lesson most Derry children learned earlier. And well, Randmarcher says he's got Florida State Police looking for Winterbagger and that his responsibility ends there. Matters of custody are more than provides of the lawyers than that of the police. This pompous, overweight asshole is quoted as saying is last Friday's Derry news, but the Toro boys, that's something else. Wonderful home life. Play football for the Derry Tigers. Honor roll student had gone through the outward bound survival school in the summer of 84 and passed with flying colors. No history of drug use. Had a girlfriend that he was apparently head over heels about. Had everything to live for, everything to stay in Derry for, at least for the next couple of years. All the same, he's gone. What happened to him? A sudden attack of wanderlust, a drunk driver who maybe hit him, killed him, and buried him. Or is he maybe still in Derry? Is he maybe on the night side of Derry, keeping company with folks like Betty Ripson and Patrick Hotsketter and Eddie Corrigan and all the rest? Is it? Later. I'm doing it again, going over and over the same around, doing nothing constructive, only cranking myself up to the screaming point. I jumped when the iron stairs leading up to the stacks of creek. I jumped at the shadows. I find myself wondering how'd I react if I was shelving books up there in the stacks, pushing my little rubber wheel trolley in front of me, and a hand reached from between two leaning rows of books, and Grop in hand had again a well-nigh indestructible desire to begin calling them this afternoon. At one point, I even got as far as dialing 404, the Atlanta Arena code, with Stanley Uris's number in front of me. Then I just held the phone against my ear, asking myself if I want to call them, because I was really sure, 100% sure, or simply because I'm now so badly spooked that I can't understand to be alone. I have to talk to someone who knows, or will know. That is as I am spoke about. For a moment, I could hear Richie saying, "Batches, batches? We don't need those stinky batches, senor," in his Pacho Vanilla voice, as clearly as if he were standing beside me. And I hung up the phone, because when you want to see someone so as badly as I wanted to see Richie or any of them at that moment, you just can't trust your own motivation. We lie best when we lie to ourselves. The fact is, I'm still not 100% sure if another body should turn up. I will call. But for now, I must suppose that even such a prominence as Rand Marcher may be right. She could have remembered her father. There may have been pictures of him, and I suppose a really persistent adult could talk a kid into coming to his car, no matter what that child had been taught. There's another fear that haunts me. Rand Marcher suggested that I might be going crazy. I don't believe that. But if I call them now, they may think I'm crazy. Worse than that. What if they could not remember me at all? Mike Hanlon? Who? I don't remember any Mike Hanlon. I don't remember you at all. What promise? I feel that there will come in right to call them. And when that time comes, I'll know that it's right. Their own circuits will open at the same time. It's as if there are two great wheels slowly coming into some sort of powerful convention with each other, myself and the rest of Derry on one, and all my childhood friends on the others. When the time comes, they will hear the voice of the turtle. So I'll wait, and sooner or later I'll know. I don't believe it's a question anymore of calling them or not calling them. Only a question of when. February 28, 1985. The fire at the Black Spot. A perfect example of how the Chamber of Commerce will try on rewrite history. Mike, old Albert Carson, would have told me, probably cackling, as he said it. They'll try, and sometimes they almost succeed, but the old people remember how things really went. They always remembered, and sometimes they'll tell you, if you ask them right. There are people who have lived in Derry for 20 years and don't know that there was once a special barracks and non-coms at the old Derry Army Air Corps base, a barracks that was a good half of a mile from the rest of the base. And in the middle of February, with the temperature standing right around zero and a 40-mile-an-hour wind hollowing across those flat runways and whopping the wind chill factory down to something you could hardly believe, that extra half a mile became something that could give you frost freeze or frostbites or maybe even kill you. The other 7 Baccarants had oil heat storm windows and insulation. They were toasty and cozy. The special barracks, which housed the 27 men of Company E, was heated by a balkan old woman furnace. Supplies of wood for it were catch can. The only solution was the deep bank of pine and spruce brats. The men laid around the outside. One of the men propped in a complete set of storm windows for the place one day. But the 27 inmates of the special barricades were detailed up to Bagger that the same day to help with some work at the base there. And when they came back that night, tired and cold, all of those windows had been broken everywhere. This was in 1930, when half of American Air Force still considered it of bimp lines. In Washington, Billy Mitchell had been quartered and demoted to fly in a desk because his Gladfly incidents on trying to build a more modern Air Force had finally irritated his elders enough for them to slap him down hard. Not long after, he would redesign, so there was precious little flying that went on the Derry base, in spite of its free runways, one of which was actually paved. Most of the soldiers that went on there was off the make-work variety. One of the company soldiers who returned to Derry after his service tour came to an end in 1937 was my dad. He told me this story. One day in the spring of 1930, this was about 6 months before the fire at the Black Spot, I was coming back with free of the bodies from the free day pass we had spent down in Boston. When we came through the gate, there was the big old boy standing just aside a checkpoint, leaning on a shovel and picking the seat of the Suntans out of his ass, and cigarette for someplace down south. Coronity, red hair, bad teeth, pimples, not much more than an ape without the body hair. If you know what I mean, there were a lot of them like them in the army during the Depression. So here we come, 4 young guys back from leave, all of us still feeling fine. And we could see in his eyes that he was just looking for something to bust us with. So we snap him salutes as if we was General Blackjack pursuing himself. I guess we might have been all right. But it was only one fine late April day, sun shining down, and I had to shoot off my lip. A good afternoon to you, Cedric Wilson, sir, I said. And he landed me on with both feet. Did I give you any permission to speak to me? He asked. Nah, sir, I say. He looks around at the rest of them. Trevor Dawson, Carl Ronnie, and Henry Wissam, who was killed in the fire that fall. And he says to him, this here smart nigger is in hack with me. If the rest of you jigaboos don't want to join him in one hard-working, dirty bitch of an afternoon, you get over to your backwoods, stow your gear, and get your asses over to the OD. You understand? Well, they got going, and Wilson hollers, double time, you fuckers! Let me see the soles of your 80 fucking nines. So they doubted time, and Wilson took me over to one of them equipment shields, and he got me a shade. He took me out into the big field that used to be just about where the Northwest Airlines Airbus terminal stands today. And he looks at me, kind of grinning, and points at the ground, and he says, you see that hole there, nigger? There was no hole there, but I figured it was best for me to agree with whatever he said. So I looked down at the ground where he was pointing and said, I sure did see it. So then he busted me one in the nose and knocked me over, and there I was on the ground with blood running down over the last fresh shirt I had. You don't see it because some big mouth jig bastard filled it up, he shouted at me, and he had 2 big blotches of color on his cheeks, but he was grinning too, and you could tell he was enjoying himself. So what do you do, Mr. A. Goodman Afternoon? Do you want you to do is you get the dirt out of my hole double time. So I dug for most 2 hours, and pretty soon I was the hole up into my chin. The last couple of feet was clayed, and by the time I finished, I was standing in the water up to my ankles, and my shoe were soaked right through. Get out of here, Hanlon, Sergeant Wilson said. He was sitting there on the grass, smoking a cigarette. He didn't offer me any help. I was dirt and muck from top to bottom, not to mention the blood drying on the blouse of my sunstans. He stood up and walked over. He pointed at the hole. What do you see there, nigger? He asked me. Your hole, Sergeant Wilson, says I. Yeah, well, I decided I don't want it, he says. I don't want no hole dug by a nigger. Put my dirt back in, Private Hanlon. So I filled it back in, and by the time I was done, the sun was going down, and it was getting cold. He comes over and looks at it after I finished painting down the first of the dirt with the flat of the shade. Now, what do you see there, nigger? He asked. Bunch of dirt, sir, I said, and he hit me again. My God, Mikey, I came to this close and just bounced it off in the ground and splitted his head open with the edge of the shovel. But if I'd done that, I never would have looked at the sky again except through a set of bars. Still, there were times when almost thinking would have been worth it. I managed to hold my peace somehow through. That ain't a bunch of dirt, you stupid cold-tailed night fighter, he screams at me, the spit flying off his lips. That's my hole, and you best get the dirt out of it right away. Double time. So I dig the dirt out of his hole, and then I filled it in again. And then he asked me why I went and filled his hole, just when he was getting ready to take a crap in it. So I dug out again, and he drops his pants and hangs in skinny shakes, cracker, redneck ass over the hole, and he grins up at me while he's doing his business and says, "How are you doing, Hanlon?" "I'm doing just fine, sir," I says right back, because I had decided I wasn't going to give up until I feel unconscious or dead. I had my dander up. Well, I'm aim to fix that, he says. To start with, you better just feel that hole in, Private Hanlon, and I want to see some life. You're slowing down. So I got her filled again, and I could see by the way he was grinning that he was only warming up. But just then this friend of his came humping across the field with a gas lantern and told him there'd been a surprise inspection, and Wilson wasn't hacked for having missed it. By friends covered for me, and I was okay, but Wilson's friends, if that's what he called them, couldn't be bothered. He let me go then, and I waited to see if his name would go up on the punishment roster the next day. But it never did. I guess he must have just told the loot he missed the inspection because he was teaching a smart mouth nigger who it was own all the holes at the Derry base, those that had already been dug and those that hadn't been. They probably gave him a medal instead of potatoes to peel. And that's how things were for Company E here in Derry. It was right around 1958 that my father told me the story, and I guess he was pushing 50, although my mother was only 40 or so. I asked him if that was the way Derry was, why he come back. Well, I was only 16 when I joined the army, Mikey, he said. Lied about my age to get in. Wasn't my idea. Either my mother told me to do it. I was big, and that's the only reason the lie stuck. I guess I was born and grew up in Burgog, North Carolina, and the only time he saw me was right after the tobacco was in, or times in the winter, if my father shot a coon or a possum. The only good thing I remember about Burgod in possum pies with hoe cakes spread around her just as you could want. So when my dad died in an accident with some farmer machinery, my ma said she was going to take Philly Loonbird up to Carnage, where she had people. Philly Loonbird was the baby of the family. You mean my Uncle Phil? I asked, smiling to think of anybody calling him Philly Loonbird. He was a lawyer in Tucson, Arizona, and had been on the city Coconut there for 6 years. When I was a kid, I thought Uncle Phil was rich for a black man in 1958. I suppose he was. He made $20,000 a year. That's who I mean, my dad said. But in those days, he was just a 12-year-old boy kid who wore a rice paper sailor hat, had mended b-balls, and had no shoes. He was the youngest. I was the second youngest. All the others were gone. 2 dead, 2 married, 1 in jail. That was Howard. He never was any good. You are gone. Join the army. Your grandma Shirley told me. I don't know if they start paying you right away or not. But once they do, you're going to send me a Wilmington every month. I hate to send you away, son. But if you don't take care of me and Philly, I don't know what's going to because of us. She gave me my birth certificate to show the recruiting, and I seemed she thinks the year on it somehow to make me 18. So I went to the courthouse where the army recruiting was and asked about joining up. He showed me the papers and the line where I could make my mark. I can write my name, I said, and he laughed like he didn't believe me. Well then, you go and write it, black boy, he says. Hang on a minute, I says back. I want to ask you a couple of questions. Fire away then, he says. I can answer anything you can ask. Do they have meat twice a week in the army? I asked. My mama says they do, but she is powerful set on me joining. No, they don't have it twice a week, he says. Well, that's about what I thought, I says, thinking that the man surely does seem like a booger, but at least he's an honest booger. Then he says, they got it every night, making me wonder how I ever could have thought it was honest. You must think I'm a pure D fool, I says. You got that right, nigger, he says. Well, if I join, I got to do something for my mama and Philly Lou board. I says, Mama says it's a Lomet. That's this here, he said, and taps the telement form. Now what else is on your mind? Well, I says I want about training to being an officer. He threw his head back when I said that and laughed until I thought he was gonna choke on his own spit. Then he says, son, the day they got nigger officers in this man's army will be the day you see the bleeding Jesus Christ doing the charlatan at Birdland. Now you sign or you don't sign. I'm out of patience. Also, you're stinking the place up. So I signed and watched him stable the element form to my muster sheet. And then he gave me the oath, and then I was soldier. I was thinking that they send me up to New Jersey, where the army was building bridges on account of there being no wars fight. Instead, I got Derry, Maine, and Company E. He signed and shifted in his chair, a big man with white hair that curled close to his skull. At that time, he had one of the bigger farms in Derry and probably the best roadside produce stand south of Bangor. The three of us worked hard, and my father had to hire on extra help during harvesting time, and we made out. He said, I came back because I seen the South, and I'd seen the North, and there was the same hate in both places. It was Sergeant Wilson that convinced me of that. He was nothing but a Georgian cracker, and he took the South with him whenever he went. He didn't have to be the South of the Mason-Dixon line to hate niggers. He just did. No, it was the fire at the black spot that convinced me of that. You know Mikey in the way. He glanced over at my mother, who was knitting. She hadn't looked up, but I knew she was listening closely, and my father knew it, too. I think in a way it was the fire made me a man. There was 60 people killed in that fire, 18 of them from Company E. There really wasn't any company left when the fire was over. Henry Whitsamstroke, Anson, Alan Snopes, Everett Miscallison, Horton Surison, all my friends, all dead in that fire. And that fire wasn't set by old Sarge Wilson and his grits or Corpone. It was set by the Derry branch of the main legions of White Dutchman, some of the kind you go to with sun. Their father struck the matches that lit in the black spot of fire, and I'm not talking about the poor kids neither. Why, Daddy? Why did they? Well, part of it was just Derry, my father said. Frowning, he lit his pipe slowly and shook out the wooden match. I don't know why it happened here. I can't explain it, but at the same time, I ain't surprised by it. The Legion of White Disintegration was the Northland's version of the Ku Klux Klan. You see, they marched in the same time, white streets. They burned the same crosses. They wrote the same hate notes to black folks they felt were getting above their stations or taking jobs that were meant for white men. In churches, where the preachers talking about black inequality, they sometimes planted charges of dynamite. Most of the history books talked more about the KK than they do about the legions of white descendants. And a lot of people don't even know there was such a thing. I think it might be because most of the histories have been written by Northerners, and they're ashamed. It was most popular in the big city and the manufacturing arenas, New York, New Jersey, Detroit, Baltimore, Boston, Portsmouth. They all had their chapters. They tried to organize in Maine, but Derry was the only place they had any real success. Oh, for a while, there was a pretty good chapter in Lewiston. This was around the same time as the fire at the Black Spot, but they weren't worried about niggers raping white women or taking jobs that should have belonged to white men because there weren't any niggers to speak of up here. In Lewiston, they were worried about tramps and hobos, and that something called the Bonus Army would join up with something they called the Commission Reraft Army, by which they meant any men who was out of work. The Legion of Discern used to send these fellows out of town just as fast as they came, and sometimes they stuffed poison ivy down the backs of their pants. Sometimes they set their shirts on fire. Well, the Legion was pretty much done up here after the fire at the Black Spot. Things out of hand. You see the way things seem to do in this town. Sometimes he paused, puffing. It's like the Legion of White Decaying was just another seed Mikey and it found some earth that nurturing it well here. It was a regular rich men's club, and after the fire, they all just laid away their sheets and lied, each pretty utter up, and it was papered over. Now there was a kind of vigilance contented in his voice that made my mother looked up frowning. After all, who got killed? 18 army niggers, 14 or 15 town niggers, 4 members of a nigger jazz band, and a bunch of nigger lovers. What did it matter? Well, my mother said softly, that's enough. No, I said, I want to hear. It's getting to be your bedtime, Mikey, he said, ruffling my hair with his big, hard hand. I just want to tell you one more thing, and I don't think you'll understand it, because I'm not sure I understand it myself. What happened that night at the Black Spot, bad as it was, I don't really think of it happened because we was black, not even because the spot was closed behind West Broadway, where the rich whites in Derry lived then, and still live today. I don't think that Legion of White decays and happened to get along so well here, because they hated black people and bums more in Derry than they did in Portland or Lewiston or Brunswick. It's because of that soil. It seems that bad things hurtful to right well in the soil of this town. I fought so again and again over the years. I don't know why it should be, but it is. But there are good folks here, too. And there were good folks here then. When the funerals were held afterward, thousands of people turned around and turned out for the black as well as the whites. Busyness closed up for most of a week. The hospitals treated the hurt ones free of charge. There were food baskets and letters and condolence that were honestly meant, and there were helping hands held out. I met my friend Dewey Corrower during that time, and he's just as white as vanilla ice cream. I feel like he's my brother. I died for Dewey if he asked me to, and although no man really knows another man's heart, I think he died for me if it came to that. Anyway, the army sent away all those of us that were left after that fire, like they were ashamed, and I guess they were. I ended up down at Fort Hood, and I stayed there for 6 years. I met your mother there, and we were married in Galveston at her folks' house. But all those the years between, Derry never stopped to escape my mind. And after the war, I brought your mom back here, and we had you, and here we are, not 3 miles from where the Black Spot stood in 1930. And I think it's your bedtime, Mr. Man. I want to hear about the fire, I yelled. Tell me about it, Daddy. And he looked at me in that frowning way that always shut me up. Maybe because he didn't look that way often. Mostly he was a smiling man. There was no story for a boy, he said. Another time, Mikey, when we both walked around a few more years. As it turned out, we both walked around another 4 years before I heard the story of what happened at the Black Spot that night. And by then, my father walks in days were all done. He told me from the hospital bed, where he lay full of dope, dozing in and out of reality as the cancer worked away inside of his intestine, eating him up. February 26, 1985. I got reading over what I had written last in his notebook and surprised myself by bursting into tears over my father, who was now been dead for 23 years. I can remember my grief for him. It lasted for almost 2 years. Then when I graduated from high school in 1965, and my mother looked at me and said, How proud your father would have been. We cried in each other's arms, and I thought that was the end, but that he had finished the job of burying him with those late tears. But who knows how long a grief might last? Is it possible that even 30 or 40 years after the death of a child or a brother or a sister, one may half waken thinking of that person with that same lost empathies, that feeling of places which may never be filled, perhaps not even a death. He left the army in 1937 with a disability pensions. By that year, my father's army had become a good deal more warlike. Anyone with half an eye, he told me once, could see by then that soon all the guns would be coming out of storage again. He had risen to the rank of sergeant in the interim, and he had lost most of his left foot when a new recruit who was so scared he was almost shit in peach pits pulled the pin on a hand grenade and then dropped it instead of throwing it. It rolled over to my father and exploded with a sound that was, he said, like a cough in the middle of the night. A lot of the orders those long ago soldiers had to train with was either detective or had sat so long and almost forgotten suddenly depots that it was impotent. They had bullets that wouldn't fire and rifles that sometimes exploded in their hands when the bullets did fire. The Navy had torpedoes that usually didn't go where they were aimed and didn't explode when they did. The Army Air Corps and the Navy Air Arm had planes whose wings fell off and they landed hard in that Pelican in 1939. I have read, and suddenly officers discovered a whole fleet of government trucks that wouldn't run because cockroaches had eaten the rubber horses and the fan belts. So my fathers was saved, including, of course, the part of him that because you're out-observant Michael Hanlon by a combination of Burritic pork barreling, fortolin, and detective equipment, the grenade only half exploded, and he just lost parts of one foot instead of everything from the breastbone on down. Because of the disassembly money, he was able to marry my mother a year earlier than he had planned. They didn't come to Derry at once. They moved to Houston, where they did war work until 1945. My father was a foreman in a factory that made bomb castings. My mother was a Rosie to the Riveter, but as he told me that night when I was 11, the thought of Derry never escaped his mind. And now I wonder if that blind thing might not even be at work even then drawing him back, so I couldn't take my place in a circle in the Barrens that August evening. If the wheels of the universe are untrue, then good always compensating for evil, but good can be awful as well. My father had a subscription to the Derry News. He kept his eyes on the ad announcing land for sale. They had saved up a good bit of money. At least last he saw a farm for sale that looked like a good proposition on paper. At least the two of them rode up from Texas on a trail bus looking at it and brought it at the same day. The first Massachusetts across this country issued by father a 10-year montage, and they settled down. He had some problems at first. My father said another time there were people who didn't want Negroes in the neighborhood. He knew it was going to be that way. I didn't forget it about the black spot, and we just hunkered down to wait it out. Kids would go by and throw rocks or beer cans. I must have replaced 20 windows that first year. And some of them weren't just kids, either one day. When we got up, there was a suffocant painted on the side of the chicken house, and all the chickens were dead. Someone had poisoned their feed. Those were the last chickens I ever tried to keep. But the country sheriff, there wasn't many police chief in those days. Derry wasn't quite big enough for such a thing. Got to work on the matter, and he worked hard. That's what I mean, Mikey, when I say there's a good here as well as bad. It didn't make any difference to that man Sullivan that my skin was brown and my hair was kinky. He comed out half a dozen times. He talked to people, and finally he found out who done it. And who did you think it was? I'll give you 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count. I don't know, I said. My father laughed until tears spouted out of his eyes. He took a big white handkerchief out of his pocket and wiped them away. Why, it was Butch Bowers, that's who? The father of the kid, you say, is the biggest bully at your school. The father's a turd and the son's a little fart. There are kids at schools who say Henry's father is crazy. I told him. I think I was in 4th grade at that time. Far enough along to have had any can righteous kicked by Henry Bowers more than once away. And now that I think about it, most of the paratrafins terms for black or Negro I've never heard. I heard first from the lips of Henry Bowers between grades 1 and 4. Well, I'll tell you, he said. The idea that Butch Bowers is crazy might not be far wrong. People said he was never right after he come back from the Pacific. He was in the Marines over there. Anyway, the sheriff took him into the custody, and Butch was hollering that it was put a job. And they were all just a bunch of nigger lovers. Oh, he was gonna sue everybody. I guess he had a list that would have stretched from here to Witcham Street. I doubt if it had a single pair of underdrawers that was whole in a seat that he was going to sue me. Sheriff Sullivan, the town of Derry, the country of Penobscot, and God alone knows who else. As to what happened next, well, I can't swear, it's true, but this is how I heard it from Dewey Coroner. Dewey, and said the sheriff went to see Butch at the jail up in Bangor, and Sheriff Sullivan says it's time for you to shut your mouth and do some listening, Butch. That black guy, he don't want to press charges. He don't want to send you to Shawshank. He just wants to worth of his chickens. He figures $200 would do her. Butch tells the sheriff he can put his $200 where the sun don't shine. And Sheriff Sullivan, he tells Butch they got a line put down on the shank, Butch. And they tell me after you've been working there about 2 years, your tongue goes as green as a lime popsicle. Now you picked 2 years peeling lime or $200. What do you think? No jury in Maine will convict me, Butch says, not for killing a nigger's chickens. I know that, Sullivan said. Then what the Christ are we chinning about? Butch asked him. You better wake up, Butch. They won't put you away for the chickens, but they will put you away from the Sonderstriker you painted on the door after you kill him. Well, Dewey said. Butch's mouth just kind of dropped open, and Sullivan went away to let him think about it. About 3 days later, Butch told his brother, the one that froze to death couple of years after a while hunting drunk, to sell his new Mercury, which Butch had brought, with his muster out pay and was mighty sweet on. So I got my $200, and Butch swore he was going to burn me out. He went around telling all of his friends that, so I caught with him afternoon. He brought an old Pure War Ford to replace the Merc and had my pickup. I cut him off out on Ridgeham Street by the train yard and got out with my Witchner rifle. And he fires out my way, and you got one bad black man gun for you. Old boss, Hoss. I told him, you can't talk to me that way, nigger, he said. And he was damn near to blubbering between him, being mad and been scared. You can't talk to no white man that way, not a jig like you. Well, I had been enough for the whole thing, Mikey, and I knew if I didn't scare him off for good right, then I'd never been shed of him. There wasn't nobody around. I reached in that Ford with one hand and caught him by the hair of the head. I put the stock of the rifle against the buckle of my belt and got the muzzle right up under his fin. I said, the next time you call me a nigger or a jig, your brains are going to be dripping off the dome light of your car. And you believe me, Butch. Any fires out of my way, and I'm gunning for you. I may come gunning for your wife and your brat and your innocuous brother as well. I have had enough. Then he did start to cry, and I never saw an uglier sight in my life. Look what things had come to here, he says. When a feller can put a gun to a workingman's head and board, daylight by the side of the road. Yeah, the world must be going to a camp meet in hell when something like that can happen. I agree, but that don't matter now. All that matters now is, do we have an understanding here, or do you want to see if you can learn how to breathe through your forehead? He allowed as we had an understanding that was the last bit of trouble I never had with Butch Bowers, except for maybe when you dog Mr. Chips died, and I've got no proof. That was Bowers' doing. Chippy might have gotten a poison bait or something. Since that day, we've been pretty much left alone to make our way, and when I looked back on it, there ain't much I regret. We had a good life here, and if there are nights when I dream about the fire, well, there isn't nobody that can live a natural life without having a few bad dreams. February 28, 1985. It's been days since I sat down to write the story of the fire at the black spot as my father told it to me, and I haven't gotten it to it yet. It's in The Lord of the Rings, I think, where one of the characters say that ways leads onto the way, that you could start at a path leading on more fantastic than from your own front steps to the sidewalk, and from there you could go, well, anywhere at all. It's the same way with stories. One leads to the next, and to the next. Maybe they go in the directions you wanted to go, but maybe they don't. Maybe, in the end, it's the voice that tells the story, more than the stories themselves that matter. And it's voices that I remember, certainly, my father's voice, low and slow, how he would chuckle sometimes, or laugh outright, the pauses to light his pipe, or to blow his nose, or to go and get a can of nectarine. Nasty guest set, he called it. From the icebox, that voice, which is, for me, somehow the voice of all voices, the voice of all years, the ultimate voice of this place, one that's in none of them, Ives' interviews, nor in any of the poor histories of this place, nor or on any of my own tapes, my father's voice. Now it's 10 o'clock, the library closed an hour ago, and a proper old geezer is starting to crank up outside. I can hear tiny spectacles of sleet striking the windows in here, and in glass in corridors, which leads to the children's library. I can hear utter sounds, to stealthy creaks and bumps outside the circle of light where I sit, writing on the line yellow pages of a legal pad, just the sound of an old building settling, I tell myself, but I wonder, as I wondered, if somewhere out in the storm, where it was a clown selling balloons tonight, well, never mind. I think I've finally found my way to my father's final store. I heard it in his hospital room no more than 6 weeks before he did. I went to see him with my mother every afternoon after school, and alone every evening. My mother had to go stay home and do the chores, but she insisted that I go. I rode my bike. She wouldn't let me hook rides, not even 4 years after the murders had ended. That was a hard 6 weeks for a boy who was only 15. I loved my father, but I came to hate those evening visits, watching him shrink and shiver, and watching the pain lines spread and deepen on his face. Sometimes he would cry, although he tried not to, and going home it would be getting dark, and I would think back to the summer of 58, and I'd been afraid to look behind me because the clown might be there, or the werewolf, or Ben's mummy, or my bird. But I was mostly afraid that no matter what shape it took, it would have my father's cancer rattle face, so I would pebble as fast as I could, no matter how hard my heart thundered in my chest, and come in flushed and sweaty-haired and out of breath. And my mother would say, "Why do you want to ride so fast, Mikey? You'll make yourself sick." And I'd say, "I wanted to get back in time to help you with the chores." And she'd give me a hugging kiss and tell me I was a boy. As time went on, I got so I could hardly think of things to talk about with him anymore. Riding into town, I racked my brain for subjects of conversations, dreading the moment when both of us would run out of things to say. His dying scared me and enraged, but embarrassed me, too. It seemed to me then, and it seemed to me now, that where a man or woman goes, it should be a quick thing. The cancer was doing more than killing him. It was guarding him, demanding him. We never spoke of the cancer, and he, in some of the silence, I thought that we must speak of it. that were there would be nothing else, and we would be stuck with it like kids call about a place to sit in a game of musical chairs when the piano stopped, and I would become almost frantic, trying to think of something, anything, to say, so what we would not have to acknowledge the thing which was now destroying my daddy, who had once taken Butch Bowers by the hair and jammed his rifle into the shelves of his chin and demanded of Butch to be left alone. He would be forced to speak of it, and if we were, I would cry. I wouldn't be able to help it, and at 15, I think the thought of crying in front of my father scared and distressed me more than anything else. It was during one of those interminable scary pauses that I asked him again about the fire at the black spot. They filled him full of dope that evening because the pain was very hard and he had been drifting in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking clearly, sometimes speaking in the exuberant late language I think of as sleep mud. Sometimes I knew he was talking to me, but at other times he seemed to have me confused with his brother Phil. I asked him about the black spot for no real reason. It had just jumped into my mind, and I seized it on it. His eyes sharpened, and he smiled a little. You ain't never forgot that, have you, Mikey? No, sir, I said, and although I hadn't thought about it in 3 years or better, I added it what he sometimes said. It hasn't ever escaped my mind. Well, I'll tell you now, he said. 15 is old enough, I guess, and your mother ain't here to stop me. Besides, you ought to know I think something like it could only have happened in Derry, and you need to know that, too. So you can beware the consequences for such thing have always seemed right here. You're careful, aren't you, Mikey? Yes, sir, I said. Good, he says, and his head dropped back on his pillow. That's good. I thought he was going to drift off again. His eyes had slipped closed, but instead he began to talk. When I was at the army base here in 29 and 30, he said, there was an NCO club up there on a hill, where Derry Community College is now. It was right behind the PX, where you used to be able to get a pack of Lucky Strike greens for 7 cents. The NCO club was only a big old crusette hunt, but they had fixed it nice inside. Carpet on the floor, booths along the walls, a jukebox, and you could get soft drinks on the weekend if you were white, but that was they would have bands and most Saturday nights, and it was quite a place to go. It was just popped over the bar. It being prohibition, but we heard you could get stronger stuff if you wanted it, and if you had a little green star on your army card, that was like a secret sign they had. Homebrew beer mostly, but on weekends you could sometimes get stronger stuff if you were white. U.S. Company E boys weren't allowed any place near it, of course, so we went on the town if we had a pass in the evening. In those days, Derry was still something of a log-in town, and there were 8 or 10 bars, most of them down in the part of town they called Hell's Half Arch. They wasn't speaking this. That was too grand a name for him. Wasn't anybody in them spoke very easily anyhow. They was what folks called blind pigs, and that was about right, because most of the customers acted like pigs when they were in there, and they was about blind when they turned 'em out. The sheriff knew and the cops knew, but those places roared all night long, same as they'd done since the logging days in the 1890s. I suppose palms got greased, but maybe not as many or with so much as you might think. And Derry people have a way of looking the other way. Some served hard stuff, as well as beer, and by all accounts, I never ever heard the stuff you could get in town was 10 times as good at the Rock Goat whiskey and bathtub gin you could get at the White Boys NCO on Friday and Saturday nights. The downtown hooch came over on the border from Canada in pulp trucks, and most of them bottles had what the labels said. The good stuff was expensive, but there were plenty of furnace oils too, and it might hang over you over, but it didn't kill you. And if you did go blind, it didn't last. On any given night, you'd have to duck your head when the bottles came flying by. There was Nan's, the Paradise Wally Spa, the Silver Dollar, and one bar, the Powder and Horn, where you could sometimes get a whore. Oh, you could pick up a woman, get at any pig. You couldn't even have to work at it that hard. There was a lot of them, wanting to find out if a slice off an array loaf was any different. But to kids like me and Trevor Dawson and Carl Roon, my friends in those days, the thought of buying a whore, a white whore, that was something you had to sit down and consider. As I've told you, he was heavily doped that night. I don't believe he would have said any of that stuff, not to his 15-year-old son. If he had not been, well, it wasn't very long before an representative of the town, Cottonell, showed up, wanted to see Major Fuller. He said he wanted to talk about some problems between the town peoples and the unlisted men, and concerns of the alternate and questions of property. But what he really wanted Fuller to know was as clear as a window pane. They didn't want no army niggers and their pigs bothering white women and drinking legal hooch at a bar where only white men was supposed to be standing and drinking legal hooch. All of which was a laugh, all right. The flower of white womanhood they were so worried about was mostly a bunch of bar bags. And as far as getting in the way of the man, well, all I can say is that I never saw a member of the Derry town conical town down in the Silver Dollar or in the Powder Horn. The man who drank in those dives were pulp cutters and those big red and black checked lumbermen's jackets, scars and scabs all over their hands, some of them missing eyes or fingers, all of them missing most of their teeth, all of them smelling like wood chips and sawdust and sap. They wore green flannel pants and green gum rubber boots and tracked snow across the floor until it was black with it. They smelled big, Mikey, and they walked big and they talked big. They were big. I was in Wally's spa one night when I saw a fella split his shirt right down one arm while he was arm wrestling this other fella. It didn't just rip. You probably think that's what I mean, but it ain't. Arm of the man's shirt damn near exploded, sort of blew off his arm in rags, and everybody cheered and applauded, and somebody slapped me on the back and said, "That's what you call an arm wrestling fart, blackface." And I'm telling you, is that if the man who used those blind pigs on Friday and Saturday nights when they come out of the woods to drink whiskey and fuck women instead of knotholes greased up with lard, if those men hadn't wanted us there, they would have thrown us out on our asses. But the fact of it was, Mikey, they didn't seem to give much of a toot one way or another. One of them took me aside one night. He was 6 foot, which was damn big for those days, and he was dead drunk. He smelled as high as a basket of month-old peaches, and he stepped out of his clothes. I think they would have stood up alone. He looks at him and says, "Mister, I gotta ask you something, me. Are you being a Negro?" "That's right," I says. "Come va," he says in a St. John Valerie French that sounds almost like Conju talk, and grins so big. I saw all 4 of his teeth. I knew you was me, hey? I seen one in a book once. Had the same, and he couldn't think how to say that what was on his mind. So he reaches out and flaps at my mouth. "Big lips," I says. Yeah, he says, laughing like a kid. "Big lips. Oliver Leverin, big lips. Gonna buy you a beer, me." "Buy away," I says, not wanting to get on his bad side. He laughed at that too, and clapped me on the back, almost knocking me on my face, and punched his way up to the plank wood bar, where there must have been 70 men and maybe 15 women lined up. I need 2 bars 4 I teared this dump apart. He yells at a bartender, who was big lug with a broken nose named Romeo Dipperin. "1 for me, and 1 poor animal left in a liverist." and they all laugh like hell at that, but not in a mean way, Mikey. So he gets the beer and gives me mine, and he says, "What's your name? I don't want to call you Big Leaps, me. Don't sound good, William Hanlon," I says. "Well, here's to you, William Hanlon," he says. "No, here's to you," I says. "You're the first white man who ever brought me a drink," which was true. So we drank those beers down, and then we had two more, and he says, "You sure you're a Negro? Except for them Esperate leaps, you look just like a white man with a brown skin to me." My father got to laughing at this, and so did I. He laughed so hard his stomach started to hurt me, and he held it, grimacing, his eyes turned up, his upper plate biting down on his lower lips. "You want me to ring for the nurse, Daddy?" I asked, alarmed. No, I'm going to be okay. The worst thing of this, Mikey, is that you can't even laugh anymore when you feel like it, which is damn Sheldon. Now, he fell silence for a few moments, and I realized now that was the only time we came close to talking about what was killing him. Maybe it would have been better for both of us if he had done more. He took a sip of water and then went on. Anyway, it wasn't the few women who traveled the pigs, and it wasn't the lumberjacks that made up their man custom who wanted us out. It was those 5 old men on the town correctional who were really offended them, and the dozen or so men that stood behind them. Derry's old line. None of them had ever stepped a foot inside of the Paradise or Wally's Spa. They did their boozing at the country, which then stood over on Derry Heights, but they wanted to make sure that none of those bar bags or pevy swingers got pulted by the blacks of Company E. So Major Fuller says, "I never wanted them here in the first place. I keep thinking it's an oversight, and they'll get sent back down south, or maybe to New Jersey. That's not my problem. This old fart tells me. Mueller. I think his name was Sally Motors Fauner." I asked, startled. Sally Mullers was in the same high school class with me. My father grinned, a sour, crooked little grin. No, this would have been her uncle. Sally Muller's dad was off in college somewhere then, but if he had been in Derry, he would have been there, I guess, standing with his brother. And in case you wondered how true this part of the story is, all I can tell you is that the conversation was repeated to me by Trevor Dawson, who was swabbing the floors over there in the officers' country that day, and heard it all. When the government sends the black boys is your problem, not mine. Mueller tells Major Fuller, "My problem is where you're letting them go on Friday and Saturday nights. If they go on whomping it downtown, there's going to be trouble. We've got the Lincoln in this town, Well, but I'm in a real bit of tight here, Mr. Mueller," he says. "I can't let you drink over at the NCO club. Not only is it against the religions of the Negroes to drink with the whites, they couldn't anyway. It's an NCO club. Don't you see? Every one of those black boys is a bucky-tail private. That's not my problem either. I simply trust you take care of the matter. Responsibility, accomplish these ranks." And off he goes. Well, Fuller solved the problem. The Derry Army base was a damn big patch of land in those days, although there wasn't a hell of a lot on it. Better than 100 arcs are told going north. It ended right behind West Broadway, where a sort of green belt was planted, where Memorial Park is now. That was where the black spot stood. It was just an old recreation shed in early 1930 when all of this happened. But Major Fuller mustered in Company E and told us it was going to be our club, acting like he was Daddy Warbucks or something. And maybe he even felt that way, given a bunch of black privates their own places, and even if it was nothing but a shed, he added, like it was nothing, that the pigs downtown were off limits to us. There was a lot of bitterness about it, but what could we do? We had no real power. It was this young fellow, a PFC named Dick Harlan, who was mess cooked, who suggested that maybe we could fix it up pretty nice if he really tried. So we did. We really tried, and we made out pretty well. All things considered, the things a bunch of us went in there to look it over. That we were pretty depressed. It was dark and smelly, full of old tools and boxes of paper that had gone moldy. There was only 2 little windows and lurchery. The floor was dirt. Carl Roon laughed in a kind of bitter way. I remembered that and said, "The old Majan, he a real prince, ain't he? Give us our own club. Shoo!" And George Bamarog, who was also killed in the fire that fall, he said, "Yeah, it's a hell of a black spot, all right." And the name just stuck. Halloran got us going through Halloran and Carl and me. I guess God will forgive us for what we did through, 'cause he knows we had no idea how it would turn out. After a while, the rest of the fellows pitched in, with most of Derry off limits. There wasn't much else we could do. We hammered and nailed and cleaned. Trev Dawson was a pretty good jackleg carpenter, and he showed us how to cut some more windows along the side, and damned if Alan Snopes didn't come up with pans of glass for them that were different colors, sort of cross between carnival glass and sort of you've seen in church windows. "Where'd you get this?" I asked him. Alan was the oldest of us. He was about 42, old enough to so that most of us called him Pop Snopes. He stuck a caramel in his mouth and tipped me a wink. "Midnight repressions," he says, and would so more. So the place come along pretty good, and by the middle of the summer we was using it. Trev Dawson and some of the others had partitioned it off the back quarter of the building and got a little kitchen set up in there. Not much more than a grill and a couple of deep fryers so that you could get a hamburger and some french fries if you wanted it. There was a bar down on one side, but it was just meant for sodas and drinks like Virgin Mares. Shit, we knew our place, hadn't we been taught it? If we wanted it to drink hard, we'd do it in the dark. The floor was still dirt, but we kept it oiled down nice. Trev and Pop Snopes ran an allergic line. More midnight resurrection, I imagine. By July, you could go in there any Saturday night and sit down and have a cola and hamburger or a slaw dog. It was sit down in the It was nice. It never really got finished. We was still working on it when the fire burned it out. It got to be kind of a hobby or a way of thumping our noses at Fuller and Muller in a downtown of Conical, but I guess we knew it was ours when I was mid-Castlands, and I put a sign one Friday night that said the Black Spot, and just below that company, Ian Guesses, like we were exclusive, you know. It got looking nice enough that the white boys started to grumble about it, and next thing you know, the white boys' NCO was looking finer than ever. They were on a special lunch in a little cafeteria. It was like they wanted to race, but that was one race that we didn't want to run. My dad smiled at me from his hospital bed. We were young, except for Snopitz, but we weren't entirely foolish. We knew that the white boys let you race against them, but if it starts to look like you were getting ahead, why somebody just breaks your legs so you can't run as fast. We had what we wanted, and that was enough. But then something happened. He fell silent, frowning. "What was that, Daddy?" "We found out that we had a pretty decent jazz band among us," he said slowly. "Martin Devereux, who was corporal, played drums. Ace Stevenson played cornet. Pop Snopes played a pretty decent piano. He wasn't great, but he wasn't no slouch either. There was another fellow who played clarinet, and George Banrock played the saxophone. There were others of us who sat in front time to time, playing guitar or a harmonica or juice harp, or even just a comb with wax paper over it. This didn't all over at once, you understand, but by the end of that August, there was a pretty hot little Dixieland combo playing Friday and Saturday nights at the Black Spot. They got better and better as they fall drew on, and while they were never great, I don't want to give you that idea. They played in a way that was different, hotter somehow. It He waved his skinny hand above the bedclothes. They played Boston, I suggest. Grinning, that's right. He examined, grinning back. You got it. They played Boxing in Dixieland. And the next thing you know, people from town started to show up at our club, even some of the white soldiers from the base. It got slow. The place was getting crowded right. Smart every weekend. That didn't happen all at once either at first. Those white faces looked like sprinkles of salt in a pepper pot, but more and more of them turned up as time went on. When those white people showed up, that's when we forgot to be careful. They were bringing in their own booze in brown bags, most of the finest high-tension stuff there is. Made the stuff you could get in the pigs downtown look like soda pop. Country club booze is what I mean. Mikey rich people's booze, Chivas, Glenfiddich, the kind of champagne they serve to first-class passenger. On ocean liners, champers, some of them call it same as we used to call urgent-minded mules back home. We could have found the way to stop it, but we didn't know how. They was town. Hell, they was white. And like I said, we were young and proud of what we'd done, and we understand how bad things might get. We all knew that Mueller and his friends most have town what was going on, but I don't think any of us realized that it was driven him crazy. And I mean, what I say crazy, there were in their grand old Victorian houses on West Broadway, not a quarter of a mile away from where we were listening to things like and Hager's Blue and digging my potatoes. That was bad, knowing that their young people were there too, whooping it up, right cheek by jowl with the blacks. That must have been ever so much worse, because it was just the lumberjacks and the bar bags that were turning up as September came into October. It got to kind of the thing in town. Young folks would come to drink and to dance to the no-name jazz band until 1 a.m. came and shut us down. They didn't just come from Derry either. They come from Bangor and Newport and Havant and Cleves, Miles and Old Town, and all the little burgs around these parts. You could see Fratton boys from the University of Maine at Orono Hut in capers with their sorority girlfriends. And when the band learned how to play a ragtime version of Mainstay's song, they just about ripped the roof off. Of course, it was an enlisted men's club, technically at least, and off limits to a civilian who didn't have an invitation. But in fact, Mikey, we just opened the door at 7 and let her stand open until 1. By the middle of October, it got so that any time you went out on the dance floor, you were standing hip to hip with six other people. There wasn't no room to dance, so you had to just sort of stand there and wiggle. But if anyone minded it, I never heard let on by midnight. It was like an empty refrigerator rocking and reeling on an express run. He paused, took another drink of water, and then went on. His eyes were bright now. Well, Fuller would have put an end up to it sooner or later. If it had been sooner, a lot less people would have died. All he had to do was send in MPs and have them confiscated. All the bottles of liquor that people had brought in with them. That would have been good enough, just what he wanted it. In fact, it would have shut us down good and proper. There would have been court materials and the Stockton and ride for some of us, and transport for all the rest. But Fuller was slow. I think he was afraid of the same things some of us was afraid of. That some of the townies would be mad Mueller hadn't been back to see him. And I think Major Fuller must have been scared to go downtown and see Mueller. He talked big, Fuller did, but he had all the spines of jellyfish. So instead of the thing ending in some put-up way that would have at least left all those that burned up that night still alive, the Legion of Decays ended it. They came in their white sheets, earlier in that November and cooked themselves a barbecue. He felt silent again, not sipping at his water this time, only looking moodily into the far corner of his room, while outside and bell dinged softly somewhere, and a nurse passed the open doorway, the soles of her shoes squeaking on the linen. I could hear a TV someplace, a radio someplace else. I remember that I could hear the wind blowing outside, snuffling the side of the building, and although it was August, the wind made a cold sound. It knew nothing of Kane's 100 on the television, or the Four Seasons singing Walk Like a Man on the radio. Some of the came for the green belt between the base and West Broadway. He resumes at last. They must have met us someone's houses over there, maybe in the basement, to get their sheets and to make the torches that they used. I'd heard that others came right into the base by the Ridgeland Road, which was the main way onto the base. Back then, I heard I won't stay there, that they came in the brand new Packard automobile, dressed in their white sheets with their white goblin hats on their laps and torches on the floor. The torches were Lucian and sluggers with big hunks of burble and snug down over the fat parts with red rubber gaskets, the kind ladies used when they put persons. There was a booth where Ridgeland Road branched off Witcham Road and came into the base, and the Odo passed the Packard right along. It was Saturday night, and the joint was jumping, going around and round. There might have been 200 people there, maybe 3. And here came these white men, 6 or 8, in their bottle green Packard, and more coming through the trees between the base and the fancy on wet houses on West Broadway. They wasn't young, not many of them, and sometimes I wonder how many cases of iginin and bleeding oculars there were the next day. I hope there was a lot. Those dirty, sneaking, murdering bastards. The park on the hill and flashed its lights twice. About 4 men got out of it and joined the rest. Some had those 2-gallon tins of gasoline that you could buy at service stations back in those days. All of them had torches. One of them stayed behind the wheel of that Packard. Moeller had a packyard, you know. Yes, he did, a green one. They got together at the back of the black spot and doused their torches with gas. Maybe they only meant to scare us. I've heard it in another way. But I've heard that I'd rather believe that's how they meant it. Because I ain't got feeling mean enough even yet to want to believe the worst. It could have been that the gas dripped down to the handles of some of the torches, and when they lit them, those holding them panicked and threw them but any witchem just to get rid of them. Whatever, that black November night was suddenly blazing with torches. Some was holding and waving them around, little flaming pieces of burlap falling off in the tops of them. Some of the were laughing, but like I say, some of the others up and threw them the back windows into what was our kitchen. The place was burning merry hell in a minute and a half. The men outside, they were all wearing their peaky white hoods. By then, some of them were chanting, "Come out, niggers! Come out, niggers! Come out, niggers!" Maybe some of them were chanting to scare us, but I like to believe most of them were trying to warn us. Same way as I like to believe that maybe those torches going into the kitchen, the way they did, it was an accident. Either way, it didn't much matter. The band was playing louder than factory whistle. Everybody was whooping it up and having a good time. Nobody inside knew anything was wrong until Gary McGrew, who was playing assistant cook that night, opened the door to the kitchen and damn near got blowtorch flames shout out 10 feet and burned his mess jacket right off. Burned most of his hair off as well. I was sitting about halfway down the east wall with Drev Dawson and Dick Harlan when it happened, and at first I had an idea that gas stoves had exploded. I'd no more than got on my feet when I was knocked down by the people headed for the door. About 24 of them went marching right up my back, and I guess that was the only time during the old the whole thing. When I really felt scared, I could hear the people screaming and telling each other they had to get out. The place was on fire, but every time I tried to get up, someone footed me right back down again. Someone landed his big shoe square on the back of my head and saw stars, and I saw stars. My nose mashed on that oiled floor and snuffled up dirt and began to cough, and sneeze at the same time. Someone else stepped on the small of my back. I felt a lady's high heels slam down between the cheeks of my butt and son, and I never want another half-assed Emina like that one. If I seat of my cacolins had ripped, I believed I'd been bleeding down there to this day. It sounds funny now, but I damned near died in that stampede. I was whapped, stomped, walked on, and kicked in so many places. I could have walked tall the next day. I was screaming, and none of those people down topside heard me or paid any mind. It was Trev saved me. I seen this big brown hand in front of me, and I grabbed it like a drowning man grabs a life preserver. I grabbed, and he hauled, and up I came. Someone's foot got me in the side of my neck, right here. He massaged that arena where the jaw turns up toward the ear, and I nodded it, and it hurt so bad that I guess I blacked out for a minute. But I never let go of Trev's hand, and he never let go of mine. I got to my feet, finally, just as the wall we put between the kitchen and the hall fell over. It made a noise like flopped. The noise a puddle of gasoline makes when you lighted it. I saw it go over in a big bundle of sparks, and I saw the people running to get out of its way as it fell. Some of them made it, some didn't. One of our fellas, I think it might have been Hortshunnerance, was burned under it, and for just 1 second I seen his hand underneath all those blazing coals opening and closing. There was a white girl, surely no more than 20, and the back of her dress went up. She was with a college boy, and I heard her screaming at him, beginning him to help her. He took just about 2 swipes at it, and then ran away with the others. She stood there screaming as her dress went up on her. It was like hell out of where the kitchen had been. The flames was so bright you couldn't look at them. The heat was baking hot, Mikey roasting hot. You could feel your skin going shiny. You could feel the hairs in your nose getting crispy. We gotta break out of here, Trev yells and starts to drag me along the wall. Come on. Then Dick Harlowen catches hold of him. He couldn't have been no more than 19, and his eyes was as big as Berlin balls, but he kept his head. Then we did. He saved our lives. Not that way. He yells this way, and he pointed it back toward the bandstand, toward the fire. You're crazy, Trevor screamed back. He had a big, bold voice, but you could barely hear him over the thunder of the fire and the screaming people. Died if you want to, but me and Willie are getting out. He still had me by the hand, and he started to haul toward the door again. Although there were so many people toward it, but you couldn't see at all. I would have gone with him. I was so shell-shocked. I didn't know what end was up. All I knew was that I didn't want to be baked like a human turkey. Dick grabbed Trev by the hair of the head just as hard as he could, and when Trev turned back, Dick slapped his face. I remember seeing Trev's head bounced off the wall and thinking Dick had gone crazy. Then he was hollering in Trev's face. You go that way and you gonna go and die. They jammed against the door. Nigger, you don't know that, Trev screamed back at him. And then there was this loud bang like a firecracker, only that it was the heat exploding Marty Dexter's bass, his drum. The fire was running along the beams overhead, and the oil on the floor was catching. I know it, Dick screams back. I know it. He grabbed my other hand, and for a minute there I felt like the rope in a tug-of-war game. Then Trev took a good look at the door and went Dick's way. Away. Dick got us down to a window and grabbed a chair to bust it out. But before he could swing it, the heat blew it out for him. Then he grabbed Trev Dawson by the back of his pants and then hauled it up. "Climb," he shouted. "Climb, motherfucker!" And Trev went head up and trailed over the dashboard. He boosted me next, and I went up. I grabbed the sides of the window and hauled. I had a good crop of blisters all over my palms the next day. That wood was already smoking. I come out head first, and if Trev hadn't grabbed me, I might have broke my neck. We turned back around, and it was like something from the worst nightmare you ever had. Mikey, that window was just a yellow, blazing square of light. Flames was shooting up through that tin roof in a dozen places. We could hear the screaming inside. I saw 2 brown hands waving around in front of the fire. Dick's hands. Trev Dawson made me a step with his own hands, and I reached through that window and grabbed Dick. When I took his weight, my gut went against the side of the building, and it was like having your belly against a stove that's just starting to get real and good and hot. Dick's face came up, and for a few seconds I didn't think we was going to be able to get him. He'd taken a right smart of smoke, and he was close to passing out. His lips had cracked open. The back of his shirt was smoldering, and then I damn near let go because I could smell the people burning inside. I'd heard people say that smell is like barbecue pork's ribs, but it ain't like that. It's more like what happens sometimes after they geld hoses. They build a big fire and throw all the shit into it. And when the fire gets hot enough, you can hear them hossballs popping like chestnuts. And that's what people smell like when they start to cook right inside their clothing. I could smell that, and I knew I could take it for long. So I gave one more great big yank, and out came Dick. He lost one of his shoes. I tumbled off Trev's hands and went down. Dick come down on top of me, and I'm hurt here to tell you that nigger's head was hard. I lost most of my breath and just laid there on the dirt for a few seconds, rolling around and holding my belly guts. Presently, I was able to get to my knees, then to my feet, and I seen these sharks running off toward the green belt. At first, I thought they were ghosts, and then I seen shoes. By then, it was so bright around the black spot. It was like daylight. It seen shoes and understood it was men wearing sheets. One of them had fallen a little bit behind the others, and I saw he trailed off, licking his lips. "What did you see, Daddy?" I asked. "Never you mind," he said. "Give me my water, Mikey." I did. He drank most of it and then got coughing. A passing nurse looked in and said, "Do you need anything, Mr. Hanlon?" "New sets of testaments," my dad said. "You got any handy Ronadoos?" She smiled a nervous, doubtful smile and passed on. My dad handed the glass to me, and I put my back on his table. "It's longer telling that it is remembering," he said. "You go and fill that glass up for me before you leave." "Sure, Daddy. This story going gives you nightmares, Mikey." I opened my mouth to lie and then thought better of it, and I think now that if I had lied, he would have stopped right here. There, he was far gone by then, but maybe not that far gone. "I guess so," I said. "That's not such a bad thing," he said to me. "In nightmares, we can think the worst. That's what they're for, I guess." He reached out of his hands, and I took it, and we held hands while he finished. I looked around just in time to see Trev and Dick going around the front of the building, and I chased after them, still trying to catch him a wind. There was maybe 40 or 50 people out there, some of them crying, some of them puking, some of them screaming, some of them doing all three things at once. It seemed like others were laying on the grass, fainted dead, away with the smoke. The door was shut, and we heard people screaming on the other side, screaming to let them out. for the love of Jesus. They were burning up. It was the only door, except for the one that went out through the kitchen to where the garbage cans and things were. You see, to go in, you pushed the door open. To go out, you had to pull it. Some people had gotten out, and then they started to jam up that door and pushed. The door got slammed shut. The ones in the back kept pushing forward to get away from the fire, and everybody got jammed up. The ones right up front were squashed. Wasn't no way they could get that door open against the weight of all those behind. So there they were, trapped in the fire raged. It was Trev Dawson that made it, so it was only 80 or so that died instead of 100 or maybe 200. And what he got for his pains was a medal, but 2 years in the rise Scott-eyed. See, right about then, this big old cargo truck pulled up, and who should be behind the wheel but my old friend Sergeant Wilson, the fellow who owned all the holes there on the base. He gets out and starts shouting orders that didn't make much sense, of which people couldn't hear anyway. Trev grabbed my arm, and we run over to him. I lost all track of Dick Harlan by then and didn't even see him until the next time. Sergeant, I have to use your truck. Trev yells in his face. Get out of my way, nigger, Wilson said, and pushes him down. Then he starts yelling all that confused shit again. Was it nobody paying attention to him? And he didn't go on for long anyway, because Trevor Dawson popped up like a jack-in-the-box and decked him. Trev could hit damned hard, and almost any other man would have stayed down, but that cracker had a hard head. He got up, blood pouring out of his mouth and nose, and he said, I'm gonna kill you for that. Well, Trev hit me in the belly just hard as he could, and when he doubled over, I put my hand together and pounded the back of his neck just as hard as I could. It was crowdly things to do, hitting a man from behind like that, but desperate times call for desperate measures. I would have been lying, Mikey, if I didn't tell you that hitting that poor mouth son of a bitch didn't give me any bit of pleasure. Down he went, just like a steer hit with a poleaxe. Trev run to the truck, fired it up, and drove it around so it was facing the front of the black spot, but to the left of the door. He throwed into first, popped the clutch on the cocksucker, and here he come. Look out there, I shouted of that crowded people standing around. Where that truck? They scattered like quail, and for a wonder, Trev didn't hit none of them. He hit the side of the building, going maybe 30, and cracked his face a good one on the steering wheel of the truck. I see the blood fly from his nose. When he shook his head to clear it, he punched out reverse, backed up 50 yards, and come down on her again. Wham! The black spot wasn't nothing but courage in 10, and the second hit did her. The whole side of that oven fell in the flames and come roaring out. How anything could have still been alive in there, I don't know, but there was people are a lot tougher that you'd might believe, Mikey, and if you don't believe it, just take a look at me, sliding off the skin of the world, but by my fingernails. That place was like a smelting furnace. It was a hell of flames of smoke, but people came running out in the regular Tourette. There was so many that Trev didn't even dare back the truck up again for the fear he would run over some of them. So he got out and ran back to me, leaving it where as it was. We stood there, watching it end. It hadn't been 5 minutes all told, but it felt like forever. The last dozen or so that made it out were on fire. People grabbed them and started to roll them around on the ground, trying to put them out. Looking in, we could see other people trying to come, and we knew they weren't never going to make it. Trev grabbed my hand, and I grabbed him back twice as hard. We stood there holding hands, just like you and me are down and doing now. Mikey with him, with his nose broken, blood running down his face, and his eyes puffing shut, and we watched them people. They were the real ghosts we saw that night. Nothing but shimmers, shaped like men and women in that fire, walking toward the open and Trev and Bash with Sergeant Wilson's truck. Some of them had their arms held out, like they expected someone to save them. The others just walked, but they didn't seem to get nowhere. Their clothes were blazing, their faces were running, and one after another, they just toppled over and you didn't see them no more. The last one was a woman. Her dress had burned off her, and there she was in her slip. She was burning like a candle. She seemed to took right at me at the end, and I seen her eyelids was on fire. When she fell over, it was over. The whole place went up in a pillar of fire. By the time the base fire trucks and two more from the Main Street fire station got there, it was already burning itself out. That was the fire at the black spot. Mikey, he drank the last of his water and handed me the glass to fill at the drinky fountain in the hall. Go and piss the bed tonight, I guess, Mikey. I kissed his cheek and then went out into the hall and filled his glass. When I returned, he was drifting away again, his eyes glassing and complacent. Then I put the glass on the nightable. He mumbled a thank you. I could barely understand. I looked at the west clocks on his table and saw it was almost 8. Time for me to go home. I leaned over to kiss him goodbye and instead heard myself whisper, "What did you see?" His eyes, which were now slipping shut, barely turned toward the sound of my voice. He might have known it was me, or he might have believed he was hearing the voice of his own thoughts. "Huh? The thing you saw," I whispered. I didn't want to hear, but I had to hear. I was both hot and cold, my eyes burning, my hands freezing, but I had to hear. As I suppose Lot's wives, had to turn back and look at the destruction of Sodom. "'Twas a bird," he said, "right over the last of those running men. A hawk, maybe, what they were called a cantrell, but it was big, never told. No one could have been locked up. That bird was maybe 60 feet from wingtip to wingtip. It was the size of a Japanese zero, but I seen its eyes, and I think it's seen me." His head slipped over to the side towards the window, where the dark was coming. It swooped and grabbed that last man up. Got him right by the sheet. It did, and I heard that bird's wings. The sound was like fire, and it hovered, and I thought, birds can hover, but this one could, because he fell silent. "Why, Daddy?" I whispered. "Why couldn't it hover?" "It didn't hover," he said. I sat there in silence, thinking he had gone to sleep for sure. This time, I had never been so afraid in my life, because 4 years before, I had seen that bird. Somehow, in some unimaginable way, I had earlier nearly forgotten that nightmare. It was my father who brought it back. "It didn't hover," he said. "It floated. It floated. There were big bunches of balloons tied to wings, and it floated. My father went to sleep." March 1st, 1985. It's come again. I know that now. I'll wait, but in my heart I know it. I'm not sure I can stand it. As a kid, I was able to deal with it, but it's different with kids. Some fundable way, it's different. I wrote all of that last night in the kind of frenzy. Not that I could have gone home anyway. Derry has been blanketed in a thick glaze of ice, and although the sun is out this morning, nothing is moving. I wrote until long after 3 this morning, pushing the pen faster and faster, trying to get it all out. I had forgotten about seeing the giant bird when I was 11. It was my father's story that brought it back, and I never forgot it again. Not anything. In a way, I suppose, it was the final gift to me. A terrible gift, you would say, but wonderful in its way. I slept right where I was. I had my head in my arms, my notebook and pen on the table in front of me. I woke up this morning with a numb ass and an aching back, but feeling free, somehow, purged of that old story. And then I saw that I had company in the night as I slept. The tracks drying to faint, muddy impressions led from the front door of the library. When I locked, I always locked it to the desk where I slept. There were no tracks leading away. Whatever it was, it came to me in the night, left its talisman, and then simply disappeared. Tied to my reading lamp was a single balloon filled with helium. It floated in a morning sun ray which slanted in through one of the high windows. On it was a picture of my face, the eyes gone blood running down from the rag sockets. A scream distorted the mouth of the balloon's fin and burgling rubbered skin. I looked at it and I screamed. The scream echoed through the library, echoing back, vibrating from the circular iron staircase leading to the stacks. The balloon burst with a bang.